October 15, 1944. A quiet Sunday afternoon on a farm near Lincoln, Nebraska. German prisoners of war walked in from the fields, expecting cold stares, scraps of food, and the walls of a barracks. Instead, they smelled roast chicken, saw pies cooling on the windowsill, and heard children laughing on the porch. These men had marched across Europe as enemies. Now they were being invited to sit at American dinner tables. It was a moment so strange, so unexpected, it shook everything they thought they knew about war and about America. Stay with me as we uncover this unbelievable true story. And if you enjoy these hidden war tales, please subscribe, like and support the channel so I can bring you more stories the history books leave out. October winds whipped through Norfolk Harbor as grey ships slid slowly into their berths. For the men crowding the decks, the spray of salt water stung their faces with a bitter reminder this was no triumphant landing. These were German prisoners of war, shipped across the Atlantic in their tens of thousands. Their boots clanged against metal as they shuffled forward, the sharp smell of diesel from tugboats mixing with sweat and damp wool uniforms. The United States had received its human cargo, the defeated soldiers of the Reich. More than 400,000 German POWs would eventually be scattered across the American continent, held in over 500 camps stretching from Texas to Minnesota, California to Alabama. In October 1944 alone, thousands disembarked from Liberty ships and troop transports, their wrists sore from days in confinement, their minds heavy with expectation. They had been told America was a land of propaganda lies, a place where they would be beaten, starved, or worked to death. The Atlantic crossing did little to ease that fear. One soldier later wrote in his diary, "We had seen U-boats sunk, comrades drowned, and now we were told to expect hunger. The guards said nothing. We waited for cruelty." His words captured the iron weight pressing down on men who had grown up under a regime that spoke only of American barbarity. For them, Norfolk and New York were supposed to be gateways into misery. Yet even here at the docks, small contradictions unsettled them. Dock workers moved briskly but without malice. Cranes clanked overhead, and Red Cross representatives clipped notes on paper as the men were processed. There were no shouted insults, no blows from rifle stocks. Instead, the prisoners were given bread, coffee, and a place in the line. The bread was soft, fresh, and warm, more than many had tasted in years. The paradox was undeniable. Defeated soldiers who had once believed themselves masters of Europe were now standing in line, their stomachs filling with American food. The clang of chains and boots echoed against warehouses painted in neat civilian colors. The air reeked of tar, oil, and seaweed, yet the mood shifted ever so slightly from terror to disbelief. From the docks, long lines of guarded convoys carried them to rail stations. It was here that their first real vision of America began to take hold. Through the smudged glass of troop trains, prisoners saw small towns untouched by bombs, shop windows lit even at dusk, families strolling streets without fear. They pressed their faces to the cold glass, murmuring to each other in disbelief. "Alice intact," one whispered. "Everything intact." "Oh, so fit," one American officer watching them later recalled. They were like men arriving from another planet. They had expected ruin and instead found normalcy. That sense of disorientation was as powerful as any weapon. The numbers tell the scale. Each week in late 1944, as many as 30,000 prisoners arrived on US soil. Camps were already rising in the heartland, their barbed wire glinting in morning frost, their barracks built of wood cut and shipped in haste. Trucks roared through ports, soldiers shouted names for muster, and the rhythm of America's wartime machine absorbed its new captives. The irony grew sharper. The men had come believing their captors were monsters, yet as they ate their first meals and boarded trains without violence, they began to sense a truth more unsettling than cruelty, indifference mixed with abundance. America did not seem intent on punishing them. It seemed intent on moving forward, on harvesting crops, filling factories, and letting its war machine run without pause. For the prisoners, the journey inland was just beginning. Soon they would learn that their lives behind wire would not be defined by starvation, but by order, work, and even glimpses of humanity. But this was only the beginning. The trains rattled westward, their wheels pounding a steady rhythm as they cut across the American countryside. Inside the cars, German prisoners leaned against wooden benches, the air thick with sweat and damp wool. Guards sat at either end, rifles across their knees, but it was the scenery outside the windows that commanded the captives' attention. They had imagined shattered landscapes and hungry faces. Instead, they saw farmhouses with painted shutters, silos standing tall against the sky, and fields stretching endlessly beneath the autumn sun. From Norfolk, New York, and Boston, the prisoners were dispersed across the continent. By the end of 1944, trains had delivered them to places many had never heard of: Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, Iowa, and Minnesota. The heartland swallowed them whole. To men who had grown up under bomb raids and ration cards, the contrast was jarring. "We could not understand," recalled former POW Hans Schmidt. "Where were the ruins? Where was the hunger? America seemed untouched by war." That paradox ran deep. Germany had preached that Allied nations were collapsing under shortages, yet from their train seats, prisoners saw grocery store billboards flashing words like milk, bread, fresh fruit. They saw children with ice cream cones, cars gleaming on driveways, women in coats pushing prams. Even the air seemed richer, a mix of cut hay, smoke from coal stoves, and the faint sweetness of harvest. The guards said little. Their silence carried its own message. These men were no longer a threat, merely cargo to be processed. And so the POWs whispered among themselves. Some cursed fate, others sat in numb disbelief. One soldier, staring out at a vast Nebraska cornfield, muttered, "This country is too big to defeat." Each train convoy carried hundreds, and in the peak months of 1944, as many as 1,500 prisoners a day rolled through Midwestern depots. Station masters and local farmers gathered to watch the foreign soldiers through slatted windows. There was tension, even hostility, but also curiosity. Newspaper reports circulated in towns like Lincoln and Des Moines. Enemy prisoners arrived by rail, accompanied by grainy photographs of barbed wire convoys. Yet many civilians, seeing them firsthand, were surprised by how ordinary they looked. Boys with sunken eyes and stubbled jaws, men who were thin but not feral. The journey inland lasted days. At night, the prisoners dozed fitfully, their breath fogging the glass. The clang of couplings and the hiss of steam filled the dark cars. Some were handed sandwiches at stops, thick slices of white bread with cold meat, wrapped in paper. For men who had eaten ersatz rations back home, it was another disorienting shock. Even their train food, one recalled later, was more than what we saw at the front. But awe mingled with unease. Beyond the windows, America's abundance loomed like a mirror held up to their own shattered nation. The paradox sharpened. The Reich had promised them dominance, yet here they were, traveling deeper into a land whose strength was measured not only in tanks and planes, but in barns filled with grain and tables filled with food. By the time the trains screeched into rural sidings, the men were weary, bewildered, and strangely subdued. They had crossed an ocean expecting vengeance. Instead, they were rolling into a countryside where life carried on as though war was a rumor from across the sea. That realization, that America could fight a global war and still keep its heartland unscarred, unsettled them more than open hostility ever could. Ahead lay the camps, their wooden barracks and coils of barbed wire waiting in the frost. And there, within those fences, the next paradox awaited: that captivity could feel more orderly, even more humane than freedom had in the crumbling Reich. The camps rose from the plains like small wooden fortresses, neat rows of barracks, watchtowers at the corners, and barbed wire glinting in the morning frost. For many German POWs, the first glimpse was a relief. After weeks of fear, here was something familiar: fences, guards, military precision. They braced for hunger and cruelty, but what they found inside unsettled them more than hardship ever could. Each compound was built to the same blueprint: long, tar-papered wooden barracks, heated by coal stoves, lined the interior. A mess hall stood at the center, its steel doors banging as cooks wheeled in trays. Beyond that lay a chapel, a small library, and even classrooms with chalkboards. The smell of boiled potatoes, meat, and coffee drifted through the air at mealtimes, aromas that struck the prisoners like a dream. By US law, and under the watch of the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners were entitled to treatment equal to that of American soldiers. Red Cross inspectors moved briskly through the camps, clipboards in hand, ensuring rules were followed. They counted rations, checked water supplies, inspected infirmaries, and the results were staggering to men who had marched through the ruins of Europe. A standard POW ration included meat, milk, bread, butter, eggs, and fruit. Often 3,000 calories a day, far more than the German civilian diet at home. One prisoner later recalled in his memoir, "The bread was white, soft, and almost sweet. We had forgotten bread like that existed." Another, who had been wounded in Normandy, described clean infirmaries, vaccinations, and dental care. "They even repaired my teeth. In Germany, our wounded went months without treatment. Here I was given a new smile." Order defined every hour. Reveille sounded at dawn, boots thudded across wooden floors, and prisoners marched to breakfast under the eyes of guards. Afternoons brought work inside the compound, carpentry shops, metal workshops, and classes where professors, themselves prisoners, lectured on mathematics, languages, and engineering. Some took up painting or theatre. Others filled libraries with German classics shipped by the Red Cross. Soccer fields and makeshift theatres echoed with shouts and laughter, guarded yet oddly normal. But beneath the routines lay paradox. These men, who had once believed themselves soldiers of a master race, now found their lives improved by capture. Some gained weight, their hollow cheeks filling out. Others regained health lost in years of shortages. Even the guards noticed. One American sergeant at a Texas camp wrote home, "It's strange, these men are prisoners, but they look healthier every month. Our boys overseas can't say the same." Still, not everything was easy. Rules were strict. Rule calls froze men in the winter air, and punishment awaited anyone who broke regulations. Escapes were rare, but attempts did happen. Guards shot at men caught climbing wire, and discipline was swift. The paradox again, freedom was gone, but survival was almost assured. Inside the barracks at night, whispers turned to wonder, was this really America? Could their enemy truly treat them this well while fighting a war of annihilation abroad? Diaries captured the confusion. "We had been told we would starve," wrote Kurt L., a former infantryman. "Instead, I drink milk with every meal. My family at home would not believe it." The camps became mirrors. They reflected not only America's strength but its confidence. A nation so secure it could treat enemy soldiers better than those soldiers had treated their own civilians. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality, and it gnawed at the prisoners' sense of superiority. Soon, the routine of fences and barracks would give way to something even stranger, the call to work beyond the wire, among the very civilians they once expected to hate them. And in those fields and farms, the real unraveling of their expectations would begin. The summons came in clipped English through the barracks. Work details, fall in. At first the prisoners bristled. They feared back-breaking labor meant to punish the kind they had heard whispered about in Soviet camps. Instead, they discovered something entirely different, a system designed less for vengeance than for necessity. America's farms and factories were desperate for hands, and the enemy in its custody would become part of the solution. By 1944, more than 12 million American men and women served in uniform, leaving yawning gaps in the labor force. Farmers across the Midwest watched fields grow wild, orchards go unpicked, and livestock go untended. War Department responded with policy under the Geneva Convention. POWs could be assigned non-military labor. In return, they were to be compensated, not in cash, but in coupons redeemable, in camp canteens for cigarettes, soap, or small luxuries. The system was startlingly bureaucratic. Farmers submitted requests, the government approved contracts, and guarded trucks rolled out at dawn, carrying crews of prisoners. Rifles at their backs, they marched into fields of corn, wheat, and cotton, their boots sinking into soil rather than mud-filled trenches. What they had imagined as punishment turned into honest work, strangely dignified compared to the ruin they had left in Europe. One Nebraska farmer later recalled his surprise. They knew how to handle tools. Some had grown up on farms back home, and they worked steady, quieter than local boys, but quicker too. For the prisoners, the paradox cut deeper still. Men who once wore the eagle and swastika now stooped beneath the sun, pulling beets and threshing wheat for families who might have sons fighting in France. The days followed a rhythm, trucks rattling over dirt roads, the smell of hay and manure mixing with diesel fumes, the creak of wooden buckets filled with apples. Prisoners swung sickles, carried sacks, milked cows, sweat darkened their shirts, but food and water breaks were regular. At noon, farmers' wives sometimes left jugs of lemonade or piles of sandwiches at the edge of the field, watched carefully by guards. The taste of ham between two slices of soft bread left more than one man speechless. Yet there was tension. Some locals bristled at the idea of feeding the enemy. Newspaper letters warned that kindness might soften the war effort. Others feared escapes. A few prisoners did vanish into the corn or woods, but most were caught quickly. Records show that of the hundreds of thousands held, only a few thousand attempted escape, and almost none remained at large for long. Where could we run? A former POW admitted years later. Everywhere we went, there was food, light, people. We were lost in abundance. For many, the work details shifted something inside. It was one thing to be treated humanely behind barbed wire. It was another to walk fields, sweat beside Americans, and taste food offered without malice. A German officer noted in his diary, "They allow us to work, and in return we receive cigarettes and chocolate. It is as though we are guests, not prisoners." But these work details were more than economics. They were doorways. Each day that passed chipped away at suspicion, drawing prisoner and civilian closer. The fences had already surprised them with comfort. Now the fields would astonish them with trust. What came next would cross an even deeper boundary, the threshold of the American home. And there, amid dinner tables, prayers, and the laughter of children, the paradox would become undeniable. The first steps onto American soil beyond the camp fences were cautious. Trucks ground to a halt at the edge of dusty fields, guards calling out orders as prisoners climbed down. Corn stalks rustled in the wind, the air rich with the scent of earth and hay. For men who had marched through ruined cities, the open spaces of Iowa, Nebraska, and Texas were surreal. Captivity had already confounded their expectations, but here in the fields, the greatest paradox unfolded, hostility giving way to hesitant trust. Farmers studied the arrivals with narrowed eyes. These were, after all, soldiers of the Reich, men who had fought against their own sons. Yet the work spoke louder than politics. The POWs bent to their tasks with practiced ease, pulling sugar beets, harvesting wheat, picking cotton, or mending fences. Many had grown up in German villages, familiar with soil under their nails. They knew the rhythm of farm work, remembered Harold Jensen, a Nebraska farmer. After an hour you forgot they were prisoners. They were just men working. At midday, when the sun blazed hottest, breaks brought the first gestures of humanity. Farmers' wives, standing on porch steps, left jugs of water and baskets of apples at the field's edge. Guards watched closely, rifles slung over shoulders, but no one refused the offerings. A bite into a crisp apple, juice running down the chin, lingered in memory long after the war. One prisoner later wrote, "I had not eaten fruit like that in 5 years. It tasted of peace." Suspicion did not vanish overnight. Some townspeople avoided eye contact. Children were told not to wander near the work crews. Local newspapers carried editorials warning against fraternization with the enemy, yet small cracks appeared. A farmer's boy might toss a baseball toward the fence at day's end. A prisoner might carve a wooden toy with his pocket knife and leave it for a child. Each gesture defied the logic of war. Numbers told the scale. By late 1944, over 200,000 German prisoners were working on American farms. Their labor kept harvests from failing, saved orchards from rotting, and filled silos needed to feed both civilians and troops overseas. The paradox sharpened with every acre men captured in battle were now essential to the prosperity of the very nation they had fought to destroy. Witness voices confirmed the strangeness. "We expected stones thrown at us," recalled prisoner Otto M. "Instead, the farmer's wife gave us bread with butter. I could not believe her kindness." Guards, too, noted the shift. One sergeant in Texas wrote, "Farmers started to ask for the same crews back, said they worked hard and didn't cause trouble. Some even slipped them pie at the end of the day." Sensory memories piled up. The sweet tang of lemonade after hours in the sun, the cool weight of milk straight from the pail, the smoky warmth of cornbread handed across a table. Each taste carried a message more powerful than speeches: you are still human. And so, week by week, the fields became bridges. What began as guarded labor began to resemble neighborly exchange. Fences still stood, rifles still gleamed in the sun, but something invisible had shifted. The enemy was no longer a faceless threat. He was a man who wiped sweat from his brow, sang under his breath as he worked, and smiled awkwardly when handed an apple. It was only a matter of time before those same hands, once bound by wire, would be invited across an even more sacred line, the threshold of the family home. And there, at Sunday dinner tables, the transformation would become complete. It began almost imperceptibly. A handshake at the gate, a wave from a porch, a farmer's wife pressing an extra sandwich into a prisoner's hand. Then came the moments that stunned the men most. The invitations, "Would you like to join us for Sunday dinner?" The words hung in the air like something impossible. To cross from field to farmhouse, from enemy laborer to guest, felt like stepping into another world. For many, the first time was unforgettable. Shoes scuffed on wooden steps, hearts pounding as they entered kitchens alive with smells they had almost forgotten. Roast chicken sizzling in its juices, bread warm from the oven, pies cooling on windowsills. The clang of cutlery, the chatter of children, even the soft hum of radios playing American swing music, created a scene far removed from the rubble-strewn streets of Germany. Prisoners later wrote of the shock. "I sat at a table with the farmer, his wife, and their children remembered Heinrich F. from Bavaria. They said grace before the meal, and I bowed my head. I could not eat at first. My throat closed with emotion." The paradox was complete. Men who expected hatred now broke bread with families whose sons might have fallen to their rifles in Normandy. Senses locked the memory in place. Butter melting on hot potatoes, gravy soaking into thick slices of beef, the sweet tang of apple pie topped with cream. For men raised on thin rations and ersatz coffee, the abundance was almost overwhelming. One described it simply, "It was the first time I felt human again." The children were often the bridge. Wide-eyed, they asked questions in broken German or giggled at the prisoners' accents. Some brought out harmonicas or fiddles, sparking music after meals. In Texas, guards recalled hearing German folk songs mingled with American hymns, laughter rising into warm summer nights. In Nebraska, a farmer's daughter treasured a carved wooden horse given by a POW at her family table. Such tokens became talismans of a strange friendship. And yet the tension lingered. Not everyone approved. War Department guidelines warned against fraternization, fearing that kindness might blur lines between enemy and neighbor. Some townspeople muttered about feeding the Nazis steak, but in countless farmhouses, the rules dissolved under the weight of shared humanity. It felt wrong to treat them as less than men. One farmer's wife later told an interviewer, "They were so young, they could have been our boys." The statistics give the frame. By 1945, tens of thousands of POWs had worked on American farms, and a smaller but significant number crossed the invisible boundary into homes. These Sunday meals did not make headlines, but they filled diaries, memoirs, and oral histories with astonishment. For the prisoners, each dinner was a paradox too sharp to ignore. How could a nation at war show such abundance? How could families offer kindness when their own sons bled in Europe? For some, the answer came in a single realization: this was strength. America did not need cruelty to prove victory. It needed only to open its tables. The echoes of those evenings stayed long after dessert plates were cleared. Many POWs carried the memory back to their barracks, whispering to comrades about roast beef, laughter, and the softness of feather pillows offered on farmhouse floors. Hope spread quietly, reshaping what they believed about their captors. But Sunday dinners were not the end. As 1945 wore on and the Reich collapsed, the question of return loomed. What would happen to these men who had tasted American abundance and shared American tables when the war was over? By the spring of 1945, the Reich was collapsing in fire and ruin. For the German prisoners scattered across America's heartland, the war's end brought a new uncertainty. Many had tasted kindness they never expected, the clatter of cutlery at Sunday dinners, the laughter of farm children, the strange comfort of being treated not as monsters but as men. Now they asked the question quietly among themselves: what would become of them when peace returned? The official answer was stark. The United States, bound by agreements with Britain and France, was obliged to repatriate nearly all German prisoners. Camps across America prepared for the slow, massive transport of men back across the Atlantic. For the POWs, it was a moment of dread as much as relief. Return meant facing the rubble of their homeland, cities reduced to ashes, families scattered by bombings and invasion. It also meant leaving behind the abundance they had lived among, the fields heavy with wheat, the grocery stores brimming with cans, the farmhouse tables laden with food. In letters and later memoirs, many described this paradox. "We longed to go home, yet we feared it," wrote Wilhelm L.A., a former prisoner from Württemberg. "America had shown us a life we did not believe possible. Returning to Germany, we knew we would face hunger and shame. That shame was not abstract." The statistics were grim. By late 1945, an estimated 20 million Germans were homeless, and food rations averaged barely 1,000 calories per day, half of what was considered minimally sufficient. For men accustomed now to coffee with cream and thick slices of bread, the return would feel like exile. And yet, for all the sorrow, the memory of kindness carried hope. Many POWs reported that what stunned them most was not simply the food, but the dignity with which it was offered. "We were treated as enemies, yes, but not as animals," recalled a Bavarian infantryman. "In those kitchens, around those tables, I began to think differently about what Germany had become." The human texture of departure was vivid. At railway stations, farm families sometimes gathered to say goodbye, pressing photographs or small gifts into the hands of men they once called enemies. Children wept, clutching carved toys or drawings left behind by their German friends. In a Texas town, one farmer reportedly chased down a departing bus to shake the hand of the young man who had worked his fields and joined his family's meals. Guards noted that farewells often felt more like family partings than prisoner releases. And yet, these moments also revealed the larger paradox of the war's end. The men leaving America were not the same men who had marched into the camps under guard. They had arrived hardened, wary, indoctrinated. They left softened by memory, carrying the dissonance of two worlds, the Germany they once fought for and the America that had shown them another way. For many, that contrast became a private compass for life after captivity. Some would never return in body, but in spirit they remained tied to the land they had ploughed and the tables they had sat beside. Decades later, former prisoners wrote letters back to the families who had fed them. Some even returned as visitors, bringing their own children to see the places where enemies had become neighbours. The echo of those Sunday dinners stretched far beyond 1945. But the immediate aftermath was harsher. On ships bound for Europe, German POWs whispered about the paradox they had lived. "We had been conquerors," one told his bunkmate, "and we became guests." The sea carried them east, toward hunger, rubble, and the long reckoning of their nation. Yet they carried with them another truth, that America's greatest weapon had not been its bombs or tanks, but its open tables. Still, their journey was not yet complete. What awaited them in post-war Germany would test every memory, every lesson, every moment of kindness they had known. The ships disgorged their human cargo into a Europe in ruins. Rail stations lay in twisted steel, bridges hung broken across rivers, and once proud cities were reduced to piles of brick and ash. For the German prisoners returning from America, the shock was visceral. They had left behind steaming kitchens and overflowing pantries, only to be greeted by cold ruins and breadlines. In 1946, the average German civilian lived on barely 1,200 calories per day, much of it watery soups and ersatz substitutes. For men who had eaten roast beef at farmhouse tables in Iowa or fresh eggs in Georgia, the contrast was almost unbearable. And yet, paradoxically, those memories became a lifeline. Former POWs recalled the abundance not with bitterness but with determination. "I had seen how life could be," one man later told an interviewer. "It gave me hope that Germany too could rebuild if we chose another path." This shift was profound. They had arrived in America as enemies, but many returned to Germany as unwilling ambassadors of a different vision of the future. The paradox echoed across thousands of stories. Men who once believed in the invincibility of the Reich now told their families of radios in every home, cars filling the roads, supermarkets stacked high with goods. Some spoke of the kindness of American women who shared Sunday dinners without hesitation, even while their sons fought overseas. "They had every reason to hate us," wrote Carl M., a former artilleryman. "But instead, they showed us mercy. That changed everything." Statistically, the impact was vast. Of the over 370,000 German POWs held in the United States, countless returned with diaries, memories, and impressions that quietly undermined Nazi propaganda. They became carriers of a paradoxical truth that the enemy they had been taught to despise had treated them with more humanity than their own regime often showed its citizens. The sensory weight of those memories never faded. Former prisoners spoke of the smell of fresh-cut hay in American barns, of the taste of coffee sweetened with real sugar, of children's laughter echoing in warm kitchens. Against the backdrop of bombed-out Germany, these recollections became guideposts of possibility. "When I rebuilt my house," one man later explained, "I thought of the white fences and tidy fields I had seen in Kansas. That image stayed with me." In time, the paradox crystallized into a broader truth. The United States had defeated Germany not only through military might, but through a demonstration of abundance and humanity that Nazi ideology could not match. As historian Arnold Kramer once noted, the AW experience in America became one of the most successful psychological operations in modern history, and it was unintentional. The men had come as conquerors, marching proudly in Hitler's armies. They had been captured as enemies, transported across an ocean they never expected to cross. But they left America as something else entirely, witnesses to a different kind of power. Power not rooted in fear or cruelty, but in generosity, confidence, and quiet strength. And that, perhaps, was the greatest paradox of all. A nation at war had revealed its character not only on the battlefield, but at the dinner table. In the end, America's most decisive weapon was not its bombs, its tanks, or its planes. It was its abundance, freely shared with those who least deserved it, yet most needed to see it.